Hi everyone, let's talk aesthetics with me, Dr. Elizabeth Scarbrough.
Today, we're going to talk about the aesthetic experience of food. So before we begin, I'd like to have you close your eyes for a second and remember your favorite meal or dish. Okay, great. We're going to come back to that at the end. So keep that in your mind, your favorite meal or dish. So traditional philosophical aesthetics says that while food can give rise to aesthetic experiences, food cannot count as works of art. So today we're going to be discussing Elizabeth Telfer's article, Food as Art. Ultimately, Telfer is going to argue that if food is art, it only counts as a minor art. So what does she mean when she says work of art? So here's her definition. If something is a work of art, then its maker or exhibitor intended it to be looked at or listened to with intensity for its own sake. So there are a few important things to notice in this definition. The first is to notice that she mentioned sight and sound, not smelling or hearing. So in much contemporary aesthetics, sight and sound are privileged over smell and taste. Also notice that art objects should be appreciated, quote, for its own sake. This means that the work of art should be appraised as an artwork and not for some utilitarian reason, right? So often for this own sake language always rules out food because food by its very nature is utilitarian. We need to eat for our survival. But I think Telfer is right that most food doesn't fall under this definition of art. So if art is a thing intended used wholly or largely for aesthetic consideration, then most run-of-the-mill food is not going to count as art. So ontology remembers the study of being, and it's also kind of the study of how we carve up the world. So here's some ontological questions we're going to have to answer. So the first is, what counts as the food artwork? Is it the recipe? So that's one option. What are we talking about when we say food is art? Are we referring to the recipe? Or are we referring to the individual dish? So the thing that's right in front of me, not the recipe that it came from. And there's a third option. What about the meal? Is the meal as a whole the artwork? Right? So the dance of the servers and their presentations, the different dishes that are coming out, maybe that all in general is the artwork. Now, these ontological problems are not unique to food. Let's think of an analogy with music. So we wonder if food, what part of the food is the artwork? Is it the recipe? Well, we can ask the same thing of music. What counts as music? Is it the score, right? Because the score is kind of like the recipe. With food, we ask whether it was the individual dish. And with music, we can ask, is it a particular performance of the score? And finally, with food, we asked, is it the meal? All the dishes that come out in sequence? And the same way we can ask, is it the album, right? The different songs in order that counts as music or the thing that we should be appreciating. So as mentioned at the outset, Telfer is going to argue that if food is art, then it's a minor art. She gives three major reasons for this. The first is that food is necessarily transient. The second is that food can't have meaning. And the third is that it can't move us. So the first is that food is necessarily transient. So transience matters here in two ways. First, it limits contemplation. So the food, like if I want to eat it while it's hot, I just don't have that much time to appreciate it. And the second, because it's transient, it can't acquire the status that old works of art can. So works of art speak to multiple generations. Think of the Mona Lisa and how many different generations got to appreciate that versus a particular dish. So think about this. She thinks that we can't actually record a meal the same way that we could record even, let's say, a performance artwork, because we can't reliably record the performance of a cook. Second, she thinks that food can't have meaning. And this is because it can't represent anything in the same way that visual art or literature can. So visual art could represent a flower in a very explicit way, and a food cannot do that. But again, here, I think we have an analogy with music. Music also doesn't have meaning in the same way that visual art does. But unlike food, Telfer thinks that music can express emotions. So this brings us to Telfer's third point. She thinks that food cannot move us like music. So she says, quote, "Speaking for myself, I should say that good food can elate us, invigorate us, startle us, excite us, cheer us with a kind of warmth and joy, but cannot fundamentally shake us in the way that the symptoms are tears or a sensation of fear," end quote. So music can bring us to tears, it can shake us in fear, and she thinks that food can't do that. Do you agree? Do you disagree? I bet many of you disagree. So how would we combat her argument? So one way to disagree with her, right, is just to disagree with one of her premises. So you say that food actually does have meaning, or food can move us like music. I think it's going to be harder to disagree with her first reason, that it's necessarily transient. Another way to combat her argument is to say, right, agree with all her premises, but then also just say, like, I agree with your premises, but I still don't think that it precludes it from being art. I have another way forward, which is just to ask, why do we even care whether or not we call food art? And that's what I turn to now. So remember that I asked you what your favorite food or meal was at the beginning of this presentation? What did you pick? I chose this, Thanksgiving 1985, surrounded by friends and family. Here my grandmother is cooking some traditional Southern food. So again, why does it matter if we call it art? So perhaps food is art, or a minor art, but more importantly, it's part of our cultural heritage. So we need to ask, what is cultural heritage?
So art is an example of cultural heritage, art like this here, but food is also an example of cultural heritage. Buildings and architecture are another example of cultural heritage.
UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, is the international body designed to protect cultural heritage. It formed in 1945, and in 1972, it defined cultural heritage as monuments, architectural works, paintings, archaeological elements, cave dwellings, art, etc. So originally, it had a pretty narrow definition of cultural heritage, meaning tangible items like art objects. As recently as 2004, UNESCO has broadened its definition to include items of intangible cultural heritage. Cultural heritage does not end at monuments and other objects. It also includes traditions or living expressions inherited from our ancestors and passed on to our descendants, such as oral traditions, performing arts, social practices, rituals, festival events, knowledges and practices concerning the nature of the universe, or knowledge and skill to produce traditional crafts. So some cooking does count as cultural heritage.
When we call food art, what we're doing is we're trying to honor it. We're trying to put it up on some sort of pedestal. And I don't know if we need to do that. Food is important to our cultures, and it's important to our cultural heritage and our identities. When I'm in my kitchen preparing my favorite meal, using my grandmother's recipe, I might not be aware that I'm participating, enacting, and protecting a piece of cultural heritage, but I am. That's exactly what I'm doing, is reimagining and reinterpreting and engaging with a piece of heritage.
So, is food art? Did Telfer convince you that if it is art, it's only a minor one? Either way, food is meaningful and important to our lives. Many dishes are important to our identities and our cultural heritage. So next time you're at a family gathering, kiss the cook, tell them that they're an artist, and ask for the recipe.